Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. A warm welcome to all of you joining us for this new iteration of the Explorations in Carceral Geography seminar series. This particular episode contains a book launch and a panel discussion on a volume that appeared recently with Bloomsbury Academic called Carceral Worlds, Legacies, Textures, and Futures. The volume was edited by my highly esteemed colleagues, Professor Jennifer Turner, Professor of Cultural and Political Geography at the University of Trier, and Julienne Weegels, anthropologist and assistant professor of Latin American Studies at the University of Amsterdam. My name is Hanneke Stuit. I'm associate professor of literary and culture analysis, also at the University of Amsterdam, and we are your hosts for today. Before taking you through the setup for today's session and what the structure will be, I would like to begin, though, with a few words of thanks, of course. Well, the book came to fruition, or it was, conceived of during a conference held in the summer of 2022 called Carcerality in the Globalized Present, Prison Spaces, Forms, and Imaginaries. Like I said, this was the summer of 2020. So although we all planned to meet each other at the University of Amsterdam in person, we had to move it online rather last minute due to the somewhat volatile environment and circumstances of the global pandemic at the time. Nonetheless, it was a very convivial event, at least in my experience. It was a steep learning curve to do all that stuff online all of a sudden, but it was great. And we had many conversations that led into our conceptualization for this book. So many thanks to all the participants to that conference, and also to the institutes who made it possible, namely the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis and the Amsterdam Globalization Study Center, both at the University of Amsterdam. So I would like to extend thanks. Actually, in the first instance, we should do this in the first instance. I'd like to thank all of our authors for offering their thoughts to this book and for sticking with us through the difficulties of continuing to write and trying to publish during a global pandemic, and for making this book, first of all, a reality, but most of all, a really, in my opinion, really compelling and inspiring read. So thank you so much for your contributions and for doing this with us. I would also like to thank, of course, also on behalf of my co-editors, our endorsers, two of whom are here today, Andrew Jefferson and Dominic Moran. Many thanks. More about these wonderful scholars in a minute. But first, special thanks to the team at Bloomsbury Academic as well, and the reviewers there, the blind peer reviewers who've helped us to make the book even better with their comments. It's also really important to thank the Royal Geography Society and the Carceral Geography Working Group, as well as the Global Prisons Research Network, because these are platforms and organizations that continue to provide space and possibilities for scholars to come together and think. So many thanks to those platforms as well. On a personal level, I would like to thank my co-editors, of course, Jen and Julienne, for making this such a beautiful ride and such a wonderfully shared experience. I guess for now, those are my thanks. These are our thanks. Let's talk a little bit about what the session will look like. So first, I'll give a short introduction to the volume, 10 to 15 minutes long. Then we will move to a conversation amongst our authors who will discuss their own chapters, but also engage with some of the other chapters in the volume to start drawing already these cross connections between the various chapters. Then we will go to Dominique and Andrew for their responses on the book, as well as this event, of course, before we go into the Q&A at the end. So this session will probably take about 90 minutes. We won't completely fill up the 2 hours we expect, but we expect to end around 90 minutes in. So to move to what is sort of the conceptual rationale of this volume, and some of the main thoughts that we have tried to crystallize in our introduction. so that it becomes a bit easier to place all these wonderful chapters that make up the flesh of the book. So we worked really from, I think, the cognizance that we all share. I expect that we live in a world in which the number of prisons is growing and experience of incarceration are increasingly widespread. I think many of us agree on this. And this book is really invested in really figuring out how this carcerality became such an inextricable aspect, really, of our societies, unevenly distributed as its effects are, though, across racialized, gendered, and classed axes. We're curious also to find out how far these carceral practices, experience, and imaginaries reach beyond traditional spaces of confinement, and how they manifest in different geographical locations, and what the likely consequences are of actually living in such a carceral world. We believe that once carcerality is viewed as both a fundamental yet ever-morphing aspect of modernity, so basically as an increasingly common state of life, how can we resist this, right? So how can we formulate resistance against it even more effectively? So we believe that this expansive scale of carceral developments definitely demands our critical attention. And this book does so by turning its gaze to the interdisciplinary study of carcerality. It shows the lasting effects of colonial carceral heritage, shows the influence of prison systems on city management, it shows the entrapping nature of digital infrastructures, but it also discusses new urbanized forms of migrant detention, the relation between prisons and houselessness, the use of carceral metaphors in literature, but also the everyday, and the carceral implications of the uneven distribution of climate risk across the globe. So why have we chosen a conceptual thematic approach that engages with how carcerality manifests in various geographical locations at many different scales? Our case studies, they range from Guyana, Brazil, Chile, England, Germany, France, Italy, to Nicaragua, South Africa, United States, Australia, the Netherlands, and the Gulf region. So why this conceptual approach and wide geographical setting? Well, when it comes to place, I can be brief. The volume's juxtaposition of different settings actually proves, but also gauges, the truly global scope of our carceral prison. And yet the individual chapters offer situated and nuanced views of how such global trends manifest locally. Without any of these situated perspectives, we argue, such global trends actually cannot be understood at all because they remain unhelpfully abstract. Now, in relation to the choice to prioritize concept over discipline, area, architecture, or medium, it is important to mention that, well, first, concepts serve a crucial methodological purpose. They focus interest around a group of phenomena and settings that might otherwise not be thought together or thought to be connected. In this case, a phenomenon that are, or phenomena, I should say, that are decidedly carceral in their effects, but are generally seen as separate because they may pertain to different spaces socially. So we feel that a thematic approach facilitates, this conceptual approach facilitates interdisciplinary collaboration and generates new connections. Second, as cultural analyst Mieke Bal has argued, concepts can travel across moments in time, geographical locations, academic disciplines, and they pick up new associations when they do so. This means that concepts, and I'm quoting her here, are hardly ever used in exactly the same sense, and thus they are not stable, end of quote. What a concept like carcerality means in a specific time and place, the assumptions that go into the types of knowledge that they group together, thus remains open to debate and renewal. One becomes aware, in fact, that what counts as carceral is not a given. So, as prison abolitionists have warned, we do not propose here in this volume that any solution to such carceral fixes, carceral obsessions almost, consist of simply taking down walls. It does not just mean removing fences or abolishing the role prisons play in keeping populations criminalized across the world, although this certainly needs to happen. Alongside this, we maintain that we need to understand that carceral reducing its influence in the world actually involves taking its spatial embodied, but also its imaginary and emotional implications seriously. So the carceral then becomes more like the dictionary definition as pertaining, relating to, or suggesting a jail or prison. So where concepts like surveillance, security, and immobility already crucially focus on strategies and technologies of population management, the concepts of carcerality this volume engages with maintain that it is both an infrastructure and an experience, both a material and an immaterial manifestation, both a lived reality and a metaphor for feelings of entrapment that might otherwise remain outside of the realm of analysis and study. So, alert to carcerality's conceptual and empirical multiplicity, then, a common thread running through many of the chapters in this volume is the broadly held cognizance that carcerality is often rooted in the physical and epistemological violence of coloniality, which lives on in contemporary forms of population management and prison policy, as well as in the everyday precarity of necropolitical subjecthood produced by the neoliberal conditions of the now. Now, in our introduction, we take quite some time to detail this carceral core of coloniality/modernity as a critical setting for the chapters that follow. Drawing on the work of thinkers like Catherine McKittrick, Anne Stoler, and Achille Mbembe, we argue that scrutiny of carcerality's imbrications with the colonial and the modern could help us see how its domination might be subverted, even if in modest ways. If we don't, we stand at risk of remaining, to speak with David Scott, conscripts of modernity. Many of our contributions also show, however, that people will resist and remain critical of the script that they are caught up in by rewriting their position in. And I'd like to turn now actually to what is the most important part and the flesh of the book, that is to say, the chapters that our authors wrote. Some brief comments on the structure. The book operates in 4 parts. Maybe Julianne, you could show the contents on screen. Thank you so much. Right. So let's say the 3 main parts reflect a temporal analytic, going from legacy to texture to future, while the 4th contains 2 provocations, which offer political and epistemological steps that challenge the notion of carcerality from within. Right. So even in this book, we don't take carcerality for granted. And in each section, purposely, we bring together contributions from different disciplines, from different regional contexts, and we try to bring them into conversation to think through and develop the concept of carcerality across distinct spaces, time, and society. So in the first part of the book, Legacies, we foreground coloniality and modernity as carceral structures. Here, the chapters facilitate understanding of how carcerality has come to be, so to speak, in the present, and to critique its construction and persistence. So you see here in the first chapter, we have colonial prison historiography of Guyana, but this chapter also very fruitfully discusses the effects of such colonial biopolitics in the present system there. I'm going to be very brutally brief on all these chapters. This is no way a reflection of my enthusiasm as it is. I want to keep space available for our authors. So I'll be brief, but I also want to mention everybody. So here we go. So that is the chapter by Kerrigan and friends and colleagues. And then we make a small jump in time to beyond this chapter to investigate how sociological insights about criminality travel between the US and Brazil in the 20th century. And then in this that closes this section with Josh Weeks' chapter that discusses the metaphor of the labyrinth as a shorthand for understanding the necropolitical experiences that emanate from Chile's military dictatorship and its transition into neoliberalism afterwards. So after these legacies, we move to the second part, textures, which explores carceral forms in close conjunction with the prison in everyday contemporary life, but it also particularly details around how unexpected and how counterintuitive the role is that prisons actually play in the now. So this section opens with a chapter by Monica Vludenik on the use of prison metaphors during the lockdown, where the metaphor is not so much a false consciousness, but rather arises as a social critique of what is truly a global situation. Then in the chapter on rappers and nostalgia, escape and nostalgia, we have carceral imaginaries that are used to phrase both, like I said, escape as well as nostalgia for urban environments that can strongly resemble spatial confinement and restrict mobility. To the third chapter here by Louisa Snyder, which details the way in which prisons can offer both material and psychological relief for houseless people in Germany in a post-welfare system that feels more carceral than the prison itself. The prison sometimes is counterintuitively preferred here. Then thirdly, grounded in the third part, grounded in the realities of carceral expansion, this third part, Futures, looks squarely at the technological, social, and infrastructural developments that are likely to determine the futures of our carceral world. At first, we have there an abolitionist critique of the violence that emanates from electronic record systems in New York City jails, and how we can think these electronic record systems through poetry. The second chapter there shows us, and we'll hear more about this from the authors themselves who are here, right? How new forms of micro-detention reshape urban spaces. And then finally, also, we will hear from Bruce Stanley how various forms of carcerality, from labor conditions to online infrastructures, work together to create ever larger carceral conglomerates for monitoring the everyday across the Gulf region. In between these three parts, we have three interludes, one by each editor. And we tried here to sort of offer, informally, we offer alternative perspectives or implications of the issues raised in these individual chapters. You're very much welcome to also produce those, but I won't go into them because the fourth sections, the provocations, are actually perhaps much more interesting to discuss here, right? Because this is also an attempt to offer critique on what the book is trying to achieve. We have there a wonderful chapter by Chris Philo and Anna Schlier, who try to sort of determine how to think about abolitionist impulses in different disciplines that think about both geography, prison spaces, and abolitionism as such. Is it too wide? Is it too narrow? How can we frame this ethically? And how can these fields be combined? Right? And then in the last chapter, we have a meditation by Sarah Nuttall, who offers the thought that maybe the globe itself has become somewhat prison-like, because the various effects of both prison spaces, but also climate change itself, the combinations of leading a precarious life in the global south, which is of course a contended term, might offer a type of carcerality that is not so equally distributed across the globe at all. So although these are incomplete thoughts and summaries and ruminations, I hope this somewhat gives you an idea of the book as a whole. Once again, I want to express my deepest gratitude. It's a great honor to have been part of this book, and I really look forward to hearing more from the authors themselves. Let's go over to that conversation straight away.
Yes, thank you, Hanneke, for that excellent introduction. We are going to have a series of three, what we called chapter tasters, in which our authors are going to introduce their own chapters briefly and also draw some resonances across other chapters. So without further ado, there are going to be three of them. I would like to present the first taster we are going to receive, which will be provided by Andrew Burridge, who is a political geographer in the discipline of geography and planning at Macquarie University in Australia, and co-authored his chapter, Carceral Adaptability and the Global Detention Hotel, with Johnny Darling, who is also here and who's professor of human geography at Durham University in the United Kingdom. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Most importantly, I converted the time difference correctly. I was almost an hour early. I guess that wouldn't have been so bad. But it's about 10:30 in the evening here in Sydney. I'm joining you from Dharawal country, and the Dharawal the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm currently based, and which some of this work was produced as well. A huge thank you to Julian and Hanneke and to Jenna as well. And it's really so lovely to see this all come together. And I think it's a great idea because often these wonderful books get birthed into the world and that's the last we hear of them. But this copy made it all the way here and I'm very pleased as well. So it's lovely to see some old faces, but also many who I've never met before. So most importantly, as has been introduced, Jonathan was my co-conspirator on this chapter. I roped him in at some point, and then I think Jonathan maybe came to regret agreeing to this at some point. But often we had these conversations at probably a similar time of day here as well. I feel like this, I'm having some flashbacks, but lockdown in 2021. Which brings us to the discussion of our chapter. Some of this work around the use of hotels for immigration detention and various forms of kind of control and fixing of bodies through the hotel space. We should give full credit. Initially, some of that thinking came from the work of Sarah Fregonesi and Adam Ramadan, who had been looking at the hotel and hotel geopolitics, and the differing ways that hotels were being reconfigured and have been reconfigured over time in very different geopolitical contexts. But we were particularly interested in the way that the hotel was being used for immigration detention, but in quite different ways. And here in Australia, hotels are referred to as alternative places of detention and are used as a form of closed immigration detention. We know also in the US, Canada in particular, similar approaches, but different again in terms of ways in which hotels are appropriated and used. In the UK and elsewhere, hotels often are places of, quote, accommodation for those awaiting decisions on asylum appeals as forms of temporary and ad hoc accommodation and so forth. So we were very interested in the ways in which the hotel, as the title of the chapter suggests, the global hotel is appropriated in similar but vastly different ways as well, and in understanding this. And we really felt that there hadn't been that work that had looked more broadly at the ways in which we could understand the hotel globally, and the longer history of which the hotel had been incorporated into these roles as well. So much of the work that we were doing looked to the present moment, but with a recognition that there is a long history of the use of hotels. And of course, we're in the future section, and part of those questions were about what can we learn and what might we expect to see in the use of these spaces as well. So we, in discussing the global hotel and the carceral hotel, we developed 5 kind of key contributions perhaps in this piece. Just as I've been discussing, firstly, considering the global nature of the hotel and putting it into this comparative context as well. But perhaps one of the central sort of areas of focus was around the carceral adaptability of the hotel itself. So very much looking at the ways in which hotels and these spaces can be reconfigured, often very quickly, sometimes for a matter of a single night, but as in the Australian example, as one where the hotel might become a place of closed immigration detention, of incarceration for many years, or perhaps a permanent conversion, as we'd seen in hotels such as in the Canadian context. We've also looked at the hotel as a site of bordering and recognising its configuration and connection with practices of bordering. And I'm realising I'm going to talk for too long. So these differing ways that we've approached the hotel importantly through this notion of carceral churn as well. So seeing that the hotel is not a separate entity, it's not a space in which it is completely detached from broader systems of immigration control, more traditional forms of immigration detention, the circulation that we saw of those within. And finally, around this notion of carceral urbanism, which is something that we're continuing to work on and develop, though recognizing very much that this is not an entirely new idea, but very much out of these discussions around the carceral continuum and seeing these spaces sort of often very hidden, kind of in plain sight within the urban environment. So we've been asked, and before I go on for too long, to draw on a particular quote from another chapter within the book. And I turned to the work of Monica Fludernick, who I don't believe is with us today, but chapter 5 around lockdowns and curfews. And so I'll quickly read this quote and tell you why they're sort of drawing upon that. But towards the end of Monica's chapter, she notes that like all carceral metaphors and like seclusion itself, the concept of shutting away or locking oneself in is fundamentally ambivalent between the happy refuge of peace and safety on the one hand and the externally imposed restriction that deprives the prisoner of their mobility and liberty. This ambivalence in literature appears extensively in the prison as home and the home as prison metaphor. Homes are susceptible to turning into prisons, and prison cells may evolve into hermitages. The use of carceral metaphors can therefore be argued to reflect quite correctly this shift from home to prison in people's minds. So this notion of metaphor, but also this period of the COVID lockdowns was very much where the Australian hotels came to light. It just so happened that this period of COVID and lockdowns overlapped with probably one of the most significant uses of hotels and most visible uses of hotels to detain hundreds of men, mostly men transferred from offshore detention in Australia. Unlike some of the discussions in Monica's chapter around metaphors of being at home and whether these were spaces of incarceration, perhaps that turned to prison-like situations, they were also seen as moments of protection. We were protecting ourselves from perhaps from the global pandemic by staying home. But the hotels were very much not a metaphor in the sense of prisons for those who are being detained at this time in Australia in various hotels across major cities. These were described by detainees as prisons, as spaces of torture. There was no metaphor in this. These were spaces, as Johnny and I explored, that had been very much adapted into places of incarceration and punitive punishment. I don't have time to talk about the UK context in a different way in which this worked, but just finally to say that the importance then of thinking through these metaphors and ways that we talk about carceral spaces were a very lived and experience for mostly these men. They were mostly men that were experiencing the hotel as a space truly of incarceration. So I don't want to go, I've already gone past my 5 minutes. I do apologize. I'll stop there and just say thank you very much. And of course, full credit and thanks to Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you for drawing on Monica's work. So we did ask all authors indeed to draw on a chapter or another chapter in the book in order to take advantage of the time that we're spending with you all here at the book launch to get to know different chapters. Also, as we have cross-read the chapters, and this reflects also the editing process for the book, whereby for each chapter, two of us from the editing team were always trying to draw out, let's say, the ways in which chapters written perhaps from a very particular disciplinary point of view could also resonate interdisciplinarily across disciplines and across different regions of the world. So that's also an effort that we're trying to replicate here with the chapter tasters. Thank you, Andrew and Johnny, for your presentations. Without further ado, I will go on to the next chapter taster, which will be presented by Bruce Stanley, who authored the chapter Colonizing the Future, Assembling a Gulf Carceral Urban World. And Bruce is Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the Richmond American University in London. The floor is yours, Bruce.
Thank you. I've been very appreciative of being part of this project, and the three editors have been wonderful. Thank you very much. We live in an urban age where we all struggle to grasp the rapidly evolving realities of global urbanism and the dynamics of multiple urban worlds within which our lives and trajectories are embedded and shaped. The guardians of our urban worlds also struggle, fearing the chaotic relational space, the wicked problem that is an urban world, with its thick metropolitan spaces, network connectedness, and actual embodied multi-scalar encounters. Consequently, guardians look for a prophylactic to manage and order the insurgent citizenship, chaos, and future risks emerging from the everyday. Chapter 10 scales up the concept of a carceral world beyond that of a prison or a carceral state to propose that carceral urban worlds emerge across our globe in particular times and places through purposeful guardian projects of enhanced carceral spatiality, detriment, and intent. A carceral urban world is relentlessly assembled out of multiple carceral mechanisms and practices, where guardians act with brutal intent to de-risk the subversive insurrectional practices arising from being urban. Such hypercarceral guardian reworlding through carceral space making is, as I term it, an attempt to colonize the future. By deploying extraordinary domination over life worlds, trajectories, identities, mobility, and urban spaces, guardians weave hybrid constructions deeply into the urban fabric, hoping to protect their control today from disassembling into the future. Comparing carceral urban worlds comes naturally. Some are even more monstrous and savage than others in their assembling of carceral components into a package of spatial domination, immobility, and control. I examine one such extreme case, that of the Gulf carceral urban world, where guardians across this historically thick metropolitan space are reworlding in common through similar maximal carceral practices and mechanisms. This intense carceral urban world is assembled through, for example, the sharing of best practice imprisonment logics and advanced policing strategies, enhanced networks of coordination, shared governance imaginaries, entangled surveillance technologies, entwined data mining, complicity with carceral capitalism and global policing, all supported through city-to-city cooperation and unlimited investment. Four citadels or mechanisms of carcerality boost and accelerate this hypercarceral urban world. One is shared carceral subjectivities and coded carceral identities. This social ordering has colonial foundations and governs all opportunities, benefits, and restrictions. A second is the carceral regimes of immobility, standardized through regulation, surveillance, and the reworlding of urban morphology. A third are the carceral archipelagos of imprisonment and confinement, supermax prisons, ghost houses of extraterritoriality, and public executions abound, announcing the carceral with no irony. A fourth intensification emerges from citizen engagement, actively stitching citizens into the carceral net via orienting acts of urban imagination, such as secure or safe cities. All those who inhabit this world are carceral subjects, yet each experiences its carceral detriment through their own angle of arrival. I examined three emblematic trajectories: citizens and expats floating through the global superclass dream, those churned through the revolving door of carceral confinement, and those of migrant laborers. Significantly, this Gulf carceral urban world reflects the same carceral dualism which Josh Weeks discusses in Chapter 4, calling it a labyrinth below the surface. Weeks first stresses the underside of the carceral labyrinth as a hidden laboratory for torture biopolitics, liminal, secret, subtopian spaces of confinement where zombies are produced and interchanged through neopolitics. Creating zombies within a complex web of supermax spaces, black sites, and American prison ships is a fundamental practice for reproducing the carceral urbanism of the Gulf. Weeks' additional stress on a world above the labyrinth, where the dystopian oppressiveness of the decaying cosmopolis disallows any possible escape from a carceral urban world, is similarly replicated in the Gulf. Ironically, however, the carceral imaginary, which shapes the Gulf, is flipped from that which Weeks proposes. By promoting consumerism and mobility, socio-technical dreams of safe cities, and Disney-esque futurism, Guardians create carceral subjects whose amnesia prefigures a future utopia which hides its dual spaces and extraordinary confining carceral power in plain sight. Generated out of a foreboding of possibilities, such monstrous reworlding is anticipatory, assembling an always becoming carceral world to colonize the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And thank you also for drawing on Josh's chapter. And Josh is here with us today as well. So if anybody in the Q&A has questions for him, or if Josh wants to respond to what you just said, we have space for that later on. Thank you again, Bruce. That was fascinating. Over to the last chapter taster, which is provided by Chris Philo, who's Professor of Geography at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, and Anna Schlehe, his co-author, who is Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Trier in Germany. As I understand, Chris will be presenting the taster about abolishing carceral geography with a question mark. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much to all involved in this wonderful collection, and particular thanks to my co-author Anna. In the book's opening substantive chapter by Dylan Kerrigan and co-authors on the biopolitics of colonial carcerality, inspiration is drawn from William Harris, a Guyanese post-colonial theorist, and his insight that Guyanese sociology and psychology is trapped, to quote, in the prison of history. The authors take this insight as a prompt for addressing how the island's carceral system today, its prisoner state, is doubly trapped. Trapped by its baleful inheritance from colonial times, shaped by the carcerality of blocky, bounded, secure spaces, intensified by starkly racialized practices. And trapped too by conceptual framings, including those landing in academic disciplines, themselves deeply woven into this inheritance. The prison of history here is at once ontological in the world and epistemological in thinking about that world. A notable feature of carceral worlds as a whole is this sense of carceral worlds now, the title of the introductory essay, being thoroughly contaminated by their pasts, by prisons as deeply colonial constructs, but more broadly by how the imperative to territorialize space, to create enclosures, gated sites, erect fences, roll out barbed wire, owes so much to older models of how space is manipulated to segregate a multitude of problematic thems others from us, the supposedly good, pure ones. On this reading, prisons in their classic formulation, from single cell houses to expansive supermaxes, are indeed to be understood within a much more extensive spectrum of closed spaces, imprinted in the history and DNA of global northern societies as they reach across the planet. Many of the chapters signal an acknowledgement of what the editors call the carceral core of coloniality modernity. The pioneering perspective of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, one of the earliest exponents of an explicitly named carceral geography, also features at various points in the book. Gilmore's recent essay collection, Abolition Geography, stresses all manner of linkages between slavery, plantation and prison, between blackness and incarceration, between colonial and carceral worlds, that circulate in the rhizomic tanglings between the chapters here. It also signals the importance of what Ariel Ludwig, in her Digital Carceral Bodies chapter, depicts as an abolitionist science. Her abolitionist poetic experiments then chime across to Hannah Stuit's evocative interlude called Pastoral Power, where she asks how we might counter the spatial hangovers, Stuit's acute phrase, from colonial, racialized and militarized infrastructures that still remain so dismally constitutive of today's carceral worlds. Which then brings matters back to our own chapter, Anna Schlier and my own Abolishing Carceral Geographies piece, which takes a particular cut through the sorts of considerations sketched so far. Its explicit focus is the subfield known as carceral geography, anchored in, but extending beyond, academic big G geography. And our modest ambition is to underscore how much Gilmore's abolition geography shakes, or should shake, the foundations of this subfield, which has been somewhat reticent about engaging with Gilmore's abolitionism. At one level, then, we are not contemplating the prison of history, but rather the prison of geography. And doing so in a similarly two-pronged way to Kerrigan and co-authors. There is a questioning of epistemology, of the traps embalmed in both concepts of geography and the academic disciplinary knowledge enclosure called Big G geography, and by extension carceral geography. But there is also a questioning of ontology, of the trap set by how worldly geographies, spaces, locations, distributions get continually enlisted in such limited and limiting ways as human societies past and present strive to manage their peoples and settlements, their populations and jurisdictions. With Gilmore's abolitionist geographies, alongside Black abolitionist ecologies, but also with what is already being done in the carceral geography subfield, we strive to counter the necessity of geography as knowledge and practice always being a prison. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Chris Philo, for this thought-provoking taster and a very recommended reading of your chapter as well. Thank you all for your attention to the chapter tasters. We are now going to move on to the two endorsers of our book, who will briefly offer some words of, I don't know, what kinds of words? Words of critique, words of friendly appraisal. We haven't given them any instructions on this, so they have the free floor to give us their impressions. So please, Dominic Moran, Professor of Carceral Geography at the University of Birmingham, and also one of the co-founders of the Carceral Geography Working Group, alongside a few others who are present here. The floor is yours for your commentary. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be able to speak about this fantastic book. And I think the more I hear about how the book came about, and particularly when it came about, the more sure I am of how this is an exemplary example of how to edit a book, how to work in collaboration, and particularly, I suppose, we're getting, as I think Andrew said earlier, a sense of how the book fits together and what it is that the editors and all the contributors intended to achieve, I think, through this session. So I'm particularly thankful for the opportunity to come to it. In my very short endorsement on the book, in terms of what's printed and what's on the website, I think I said something about how much I valued the way in which this book brings together scholarship from different times and places, but not for the sake of it, which I think really often is what happens. We know it's important to go beyond, you know, the global north, Western Europe and the US and so on. And quite often, I think, not just in carceral geography, but books kind of do this in a tokenistic way. And I think you really have not in this book. There's a really strong logic for how these different chapters have been brought together. And there's obviously been, as we see in this session, a really careful and nuanced dialogue had at the early planning stages to make sure that those chapters fitted together really well. And I think I had, I suppose, a number of observations and a sort of a closing comment that I'll move on to make, if that's of any help. My first observation, I think, is about how well this book meets carcerality where it is, wherever that is and whenever that was, and sees it as a part of where it is. I was really struck by how well that's been achieved here. And I think in Chris and Anna's chapter, which Chris has just spoken so well about, they do that, I think, really well in tracing out the way in which carceral geography has developed differently in different places, and particularly with relation to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's fantastic work, kind of explained really well the way in which carceral geography has taken shape in that context and of that context. And I think that's really a salutary lesson to us all, I suppose, to think about our own practice and our own positionality as scholars in relation to where we do our work and why that might be. It also prompted all sorts of questions from me about legacy, and it made me think differently about some conversations I've been having, not at my instigation, I must say, with archaeologists who've been really keen to talk about the materiality of confinement and who are grappling with the notion of a carcerality before there was a prison. And I found that a really fascinating conversation with them. And I suppose it made me think particularly about the chapters on legacy and to think about how we think legacy works. What is it that has an effect which lives on? And, you know, how does the chronology of this work, and are there ways to complicate that, I guess? I also found the book really fascinating by the way in which, and as Andrew was pointing out in his summary of the chapter with Jonathan, spaces and times traverse inside and out of carcerality in really interesting ways. And I found particularly their chapter really illuminating in trying to understand how that process might happen in different contexts. And I suppose it also made me think, particularly in relation to the section on futures and relating a bit back to Chris and Anna's chapter again, the ways in which imaginings of the future of carcerality and the differences, I suppose, in the way in which people think about the role of prisons and the role of confinement in what we think life will be in the future shape how prison systems operate in the present, and therefore to an extent shape the ways in which geographers engage with them. And I think about this in all sorts of ways, but I suppose particularly in a very sort of mundane, you know, how geographers engage with policy makers who are working with certain assumptions about what prison populations will be in the future, and therefore making decisions about capacity building programs and so on, when, you know, we would argue that they ought to be thinking very differently about what those populations might be in the first place and what role prisons can or ever should play. But I guess my main observation, and I hope that this is a compliment because I absolutely mean it in that way, is that in this book, the prison is there, but it isn't at the same time. So it's almost never the focus of a chapter, and the book rarely takes us into prison in a straightforward sense, but the prison is always visible. And I really liked the way in which the book gives us a range of perspectives and views of the prison, both looking back at it, looking forward to it, and looking sort of sideways or through something else at it. And it reminded me really strongly of Brett Story's 2016 film, The Prison in 12 Landscapes, which I think does this in a similarly lyrical sense. And, you know, for me, there isn't much higher praise than that. So well done, everybody who is part of this book, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dominique. That was indeed the biggest compliment we can get. Decentering the prison and being compared to a film. Andrew, you are going to close things off for us with your comments. Andrew Jefferson is senior researcher at Dignity, the Danish Institute Against Torture, and also one of the co-founding members of the Global Prisons Research Network. So please feel free to open your mic.
Thanks. I think it's open. So yeah, an invitation to close things off, or maybe open things up. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It's really is a pleasure to have this chance to share some remarks inspired by my reading of the book. So thanks for the invitation. And it will be very much a set of remarks about how it spoke to me, and particularly since I was preparing these remarks yesterday, kind of how it spoke to me yesterday. But I will also be riffing off my endorsement a little bit. But first of all, congratulations to the editors for pulling together such a compelling collection. I know that you had a lot of potential contributions. It's not always easy to wisely select those that will both speak for themselves and to each other. And I think you've done a really good job with that. And as I wrote in the endorsement, it's a diverse and multifaceted collection, 12 chapters, 3 experimental interludes. And I really love that you mess so much with form. The interludes were sort of a welcome intervention. And I want to say a little bit about how I tried to mess with form myself recently as a sort of intro to making some other remarks about the book. I presented a kind of stream of consciousness set of reflections recently that I called a fragmentary aesthetics of resistance. And I was trying to mess with the standard forms of making conference presentations. And it began with a slide that was a collage of pictures of protesters at a demonstration who were there in solidarity with the Palestinians. And then it was supplemented with a quote. And the quote went like this. It's a quote by, I don't know how to pronounce this name, Czesław Miłosz, from a book called The Witness of Poetry. And they write, "The poetic act both anticipates the future and speeds its coming." The poetic act both anticipates the future and speeds its coming. So with this juxtaposition between this particularly intriguing line, at least for me, and these images of protesters, I was trying to gesture beyond the academy to the street, and also beyond standard forms of representing ideas to a form of, maybe we call it poetics, but also to a practice that anticipates and speeds the coming of not only the future, not only any old future, but actually a future that we might truly want to inhabit, a future that's different from the present, maybe a less catastrophic future, a less carceral future, and perhaps even a more equitably inhabitable future. And so I start by mentioning this for a few reasons. First, I think actually reading your book and I did read every single word of the book to prepare my endorsement. I think reading the book actually helped push me in this direction, legitimizing, if you like, the idea of writing in a more free form fashion, thereby potentially freeing also thought to take new courses. I don't know about you. I'm one of these people who actually don't know what their thought is until it's written down. So, you know, thoughts don't happen until I sort of take out my pen. So yeah, you've helped me there. But the second thing that I really appreciated and identified with was the way you brought social sciences and the humanities together. And I think the book really demonstrates the value of doing this. So it's not all only transdisciplinary, but it's kind of across genres of I don't know what we call it, science. So I really appreciated the chapters that engaged, for example, with literature. I really appreciated the inclusion of poetry. And as you described in the earlier interventions, the book as a whole, you're deliberately attuned to the material, the immaterial, to infrastructures and experiences, to the temporal and the spatial, to histories, textures, and to the way, and I'm going to quote you back at yourselves now, dear editors, to the ways in which, quote, carcerality reverberates sensorially and diffracts across people's relations. I mean, the way carcerality reverberates sensorially. I just love the writing here. And part of conveying an idea is through the writing. So again, great job. So a third point of contact, or a point of reverberation, point of abrasion, inspiration, whatever for me, was what I call in the endorsement the insistent current of abolitionist thought that I at least picked up running throughout. And I suspect some authors are more or less abolitionist in terms of politics, but I sensed as a whole, it's a volume that's not afraid to call out the harms of imprisonment, to push back against carceral power, not only against penal or carceral excess, but also against the sort of the very idea or the proliferation of the taken for grantedness of punitive carceral logics, dynamics, practices, and what I think of as the pernicious ubiquity of sites and practices of confinement and punishment. So I think, yeah, I mean, I call it an insistent current because I think it ran throughout, and it was very insistent. It's a book that has the potential to enable and energize. At times it's strident, but I also read it as kind of pragmatic. It's highly ambitious in its intentions, and yet somewhat attritional in its form. It's kind of banging on the door, if you like. And I think it's to the editor's credit that the chapters combine so well, generating this kind of, I don't know, what I think of as a welcome mass of momentum, both illuminating and challenging. And what I was inspired to refer to in the endorsement as the detrimental, deliberate dynamics associated with the will to secure and the will to confine. And actually, those two ideas, the will to secure and the will to confine, I think these are ideas I will be thinking about as I sort of continue thinking about confinement and subjectivity, as I often do. So thanks for planting those ideas in my mind. And I don't know if it's because it's snowing outside here, but as I was drafting these thoughts the other day, the idea of a giant snowball came to mind. Now I'm thinking about this attritional momentum stuff, kind of the snowball hurtling down the mountainside, gradually expanding in size and force, potentially crushing whatever it eventually runs into. Maybe it's not the most original metaphor, but anyway, I think it's true to say that there's more in this book that implies crushing or dismantling than rebuilding or prefiguring. But of course, as was mentioned earlier today, I totally agree with the editors that any projects of dismantlement must involve taking seriously what you've called the spatial embodied imaginary and emotional imbrication of carceral worlds. And that is what this book does so powerfully. It takes seriously the carceral in all its many forms. But taking stuff seriously, I mean, I'm beginning to worry about how seriously I've taken the world for a long time. I've sometimes called myself a scholar of tragedy and misery, and I'm kind of trying to escape that. So how serious must we actually be? Is there any space for laughter? This is where I may be jumping a little bit beyond the book itself. Another quote I used in my fragmentary aesthetics was from the late US poet Jean Ashbery, who was riffing off, in turn, the French poet Mallarmé. He said, Ashbery wrote, "Write not the idea, but the effect it produces." I thought that was a marvelous idea. And I came across it in a wonderful book called Animal Joy by Noor Al-Sadia. And Al-Sadia writes about laughter and resuscitation. She's interested in deep, spontaneous expressions of joy that take the form of laughter. But it's not nervous, awkward laughter or polite, timorous laughter. It's a sort of deep, roaring, spontaneous laughter she's interested in accessing. So I'm wondering whether her encouragement to find and express joy might serve as some sort of inspiration in the collective quest to understand and challenge the proliferation of carceral forms and imaginaries. I'm wondering how our societies might learn to laugh again, to breathe again, to listen, to learn, where learning is always understood as provisional and situated. Of course, the book is no laughing matter. It's a deeply serious and timely engagement with demanding realities and possible futures, and it must be that way. But I think any sequel to the book, if you had that in mind, could valuably explore laughter and exuberance as potential antidotes and inspiration towards post-carceral worlds. So I really hope the book gets the readership it deserves. It's certainly inspired me. Thanks very much.
Many, many thanks, Andrew, for those reflections. And yes, the anti-carceral, which is also always already becoming, right? And I think laughter is one of the most subversive acts that we can all engage in a particular way. And what you said resonated a lot with me, indeed, working with the particularly terrorific excesses, but also the everyday kind of demolition that carcerality implies on people's subjectivity, and indeed, yeah, standing from a place of laughter or joy in the face of those, that is very powerful thing to do. And thank you so much for bringing that up. That being said, I'm going to hand over my moderation tasks to Jennifer Turner, one of our co-editors, who is now going to take us into the Q&A. So Jen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julienne. I think I have the slightly easier part. I must have to say, I have to send real thanks to Hanneke and to Julienne here, not just for the jobs that they've done today, but also for inviting me onto the project. I must say, I would like to think of myself as the third piece of the puzzle, so to speak, but I was the last piece. So this was a project that did come from their instigation, and I have very much valued being part of the project. I am. And as I'm sure Hanneke and Juliana, I'm so humbled by the commentary that's gone on today. I have to say I wasn't quite expecting such a powerful reflection on something which I guess when you're part of the editing process, you often can see it very much in a kind of matter of fact way. You know, what do we have to do to make something cohesive? How do we bring these component parts together? How do we attend to each chapter individually to offer some fair editing? You know, and actually, I think it's really nice to have had this opportunity to have a launch like this, because I think it's given me many reflections on the volume in ways that I hadn't been able to look at it actually, because we had been so deeply pragmatic in many ways about the construction of the volume. Andrew, I will give, I think, a public, sorry, Andrew Jefferson, I'll give a public recognition that I think the way that carcerality reverberates sensorially, I suspect that came from Hanneke. Or Julien, but it definitely probably didn't come from me. So I am definitely not clever enough to write anything quite so eloquent. So I will again hand over the praise to my colleagues there. I also want to just draw on, just before we move into the Q&A, just onto something that again, Andrew Jefferson just mentioned, and that was, I think, the extent of the interest in the volume in its first conceptualization. We had an enormous number of abstracts who were submitted. Some I know from people in the room. You know, I will wink at those people. They know who they are, and it was a really difficult process to have to turn down so many fantastic suggestions. You know, so I think we have to extend our thanks, and I think we did as well in the book, in print as well, to the people who aren't in there, because I think their presence and their absent presence, so to speak, is also a reflection of just how important it is for us to think about carceral worlds. There could have been many possible versions of this volume which may have reflected a different set of adjectives, a different set of carceral worlds that we could have spoken to. So I think that you know, that's an extension of my gratitude there as well. But I won't indulge any more, and because I do want to see it and to allow people to have the opportunity to perhaps talk to some people in the room, some authors they may be interested to get some more details about, or any commentary or conversation amongst our presenters here today. So I don't have anything in the chat other than a commentary or a comment rather than a question. Do I have any hands in the room? Would anyone like to add anything further? Bring anything else together in a different way? I think that's a hand from Bruce. Bruce, please.
I appreciated Andrew's commentary just now, and it made me remember that there's so many different forms of, if you will, subversive laughter occurring across the Gulf. For example, just recently, a young Iranian woman took off her clothes and streaked through Tehran, and was basically smiling the whole time as she was being arrested. Palestinian women, when they're arrested, smile intentionally to show themselves being not affected by the arrests by Israeli soldiers. And there's been a recent presentation about Syrian prison music that was made by the Middle East Prison Forum. The singing that was done and the music that was created in Syrian prisons, and it made you smile. So.
Thanks, Bruce. I think that, you know, I think that's this notion at the end here is, I think, it's an important thing, and I mean, I think we could raise questions about you know, how far. Sorry, that my lights have just gone off in the background, as you'll have just noticed there. That's German energy saving mechanisms. I'll go and turn them back on once I've stopped talking. But I think, yeah, I think throughout this volume has been kind of questions of how far we can extend metaphors and how far we can use terms like carceral worlds, or, you know, perhaps as Bruce has introduced us to, these ideas of kind of carceral citizens and so on, and how far we can apply these overarching concepts yet at the same time recognizing that those concepts will be unequally applied to different people in different ways. You know, if we use a phrase like carceral citizens to apply to a more generic group of people, do we undermine the specific violences that occur in very kind of multiple and uneven ways? And so I guess when we think about the potential for laughter and exuberance and you know, so on, how do we balance that with the ongoing recognition of these inherently violent carceral worlds? Perhaps a comment, but I mean, Andrew Jefferson, you know, what would you like us to do in a sequel? You know, are there how might we recognize, appreciate violence, horror, torture, and yet still smile about it? Is that a possibility? Julien would like to talk. Please do, Julien. I'm going to turn my lights back on.
I think, sorry, I'm getting a little bit emotional with these topics, but I think in the interlude, and Andrew knows the interlude as well as a presentation, which I think was an inverse kind of what you were saying as well, trying to work with form, and also trying to work through emotion. And precisely in the interlude I wrote on carceral reverberations, it's on the one hand indeed about the violence of the systems, and the ways in which they reverberate and diffract, but on the other hand, also about the ways in which inverse diffraction might be possible, how we can look to carceral confusion. And I think instances of political imprisonment are of course, kind of, as you were mentioning also, Bruce, key examples perhaps are the ones that become most visible to us as they circulate on social media or the like, but these, of course, draw on very strong anti-registers. I'm seeing anarchist in the chat, but we can also think anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-patriarchal. So there are all kinds of ways in which these subversions, resistances draw on art, poetry, laughter, all kinds of, let's say, subversive acts that are present in spite of our carceral worlds or against our carceral worlds. And I think a lot of ways are being mobilized in a variety of anti-carceral resistances, some of which are, of course, openly linked to the abolitionist impetus, some of which are perhaps kind of organic abolitionist, if we might call it in that way. And yeah, so I just wanted to jump in there and say that that I think that some of the chapters within the book think with these fringes, or I don't know, like we can center the fringes in a second volume. That would be awesome. I see two hands. So Claudia and Andrew, please jump in, take the mic from me.
Well, perhaps in which case I'll let Claudia start first, if that's okay. If you could unmute, that would be great. Sorry, we missed the beginning.
I'm Claudia from the Portuguese prison system. I'm a practitioner and a researcher, and I'm always eager to be present in this kind of discussions on a theoretical and empirical level. But I would like to add a contribution that is somehow, I think that those who advocate the abolitionism some kind of forget those who have also a reformist approach and those who have the inside knowledge and can also have critical insights from the within. And I think that although it is very important to see it in a bigger frame, that we should not take the feet from the ground and forget those who can also have the production of knowledge from those who are working and producing knowledge and in the prison system itself and and electronic vigilance, etc. Otherwise, can be also very theoretical level and not from a live movement with different perspectives that can be more complementary.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. I might actually direct that comment towards maybe Chris Philo and Anna Schlier, because I know that you have grappled at the end of the book about this balance between abolition and reform. But I'm going to give you a chance to think about it, because before you do that, I'll go back to Andrew Jefferson.
Thanks. And thanks kind of for sending the question back my way about the sequel. I mean, I'm a bit of a slow scientist, so I don't like to come with ideas too quickly, but there was something in this my own little presentation recently that tried to be unconventional, which, to go back, it's not about laughing at tragedy or laughing at trauma, of course. But I began my presentation actually with a reflection on how being on demonstrations with Palestinians has felt quite joyful at times, despite the terrible, terrible things that we was kind of protesting against. And I was trying to grapple a little bit with that contradiction that sometimes grief and mourning and laughter and joy, perhaps at the sense of solidarity that is being generated, do actually hang together. I shared my presentation with one of my intellectual heroines, an anthropologist called Jean Leif, and she put me onto Bertolt Brecht, the dramatist. And so I went down a massive rabbit hole reading about dialectical theatre. And that's also what's put me onto this idea about messing with form. He seems really concerned with the idea of contradiction, which maybe also speaks to this, what do we do about reformers from within when we stand outside and shout at the walls? So I think a sequel that embraces contradictions and fights for space for exuberance would be wonderful.
Thanks, Andrew, for those commentaries. I also have been toying with different forms of writing at the moment, which is kind of emerged from this kind of intervention that I wrote, which takes the form of a story, a kind of creative nonfiction story. And I have been trying to think about that as a different form of writing, and on the subject of anesthesia and perhaps my own anesthesia in this environment. So it's interesting that you brought up this idea about different emotions in these spaces, because I personally do worry that sometimes my deep involvement in the violence, or thinking through the violences of these kinds of spaces, actually has the opposite effect for someone like myself, where I might actually enact some kind of self-preservation techniques to stay completely, or not completely, but completely enough neutral in terms of my ability to create emotions in difficult circumstances. So that's another layer to the conversation. I did say, Hanneke, I know your hand up is there. I did say I would go back to Chris and/or Anna, either, if anyone would like to address any of perhaps Claudia's commentary. Chris and Anna, I see both of your microphones on, so I don't know who wants to go first.
I think it's time for Anna to speak.
Oh, I don't know. Thank you so much, Claudia, and everyone. I find it really, really difficult to talk about reform and abolitionism in the same sense, and I grappled with these ideas a lot, and I haven't actually come to any form of conclusion as such in terms of my own research practice, but also just in terms of thinking through the ideas of what we want to achieve as researchers or as practitioners or policymakers and so on. I just wanted to maybe recount a little idea that I had very recently when I did some teaching, because I always feel like teaching these ideas or going back to the classroom and talking about these ideas to students is sometimes really quite nice, in that it helps to I guess it helps us think. And it kind of made me think. So recently, I went to Trier to give a talk on kind of different carceral conditions and the ideas around I guess abolitionism as a big idea behind it. And where we want to go in terms of maybe reform or abolitionist ideas when it comes to all sorts of carceral conditions. And the students were a lot more probably conservative than I would have thought, and it made me think how much we can actually achieve in terms of when we think through the kind of societal conditions that come or that kind of that are produced through these carceral spaces, various carceral spaces, and what kinds of thinkings are kind of produced by this increased forms of incarceration. I just, yeah, it made me think that I guess both reform and abolition are conditions that are really reliant on I guess how we teach, but also how we kind of see society as a much bigger, you know, I guess entity behind it that we have to, I don't know, and somehow get on our side or convince of the things that we as researchers and so on probably experience very often. And I guess the things that Jen talked about in terms of anesthesia kind of also follow this idea. But Chris, maybe you want to say a little bit more.
No, it's okay. I'm just, if it's okay, I'll just pen a few things and just chuck them in the chat rather than because people have heard enough from me and let others speak. So thank you, Anna. I'll just absolutely follow up on what you said there. But yeah, I'll just put it down in words. Is that a good idea?
Sure.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. It makes us cognizant of the wonderful benefit of having this online room as a dialogue space, because we think about the things that we can pass along to each other in ways that we couldn't do in a kind of traditional conference room in the past. So yeah, please do, Chris. Hanneke, may I come back to you?
Thank you. As a humanities person, I would like to chip in a little bit on the question of not just laughter, but also the aesthetics, I guess, in which these forms take place, right? Sort of drama, music, both in the prison and about the prison. But before I do, please, I want to also thank everybody for sharing their thoughts and their comments, and it's been a real treat to listen to you all, and like Jen said, very humbling experience, especially since I've felt very much a welcome guest in a sense in your disciplines, and I felt really it's been wonderful to be able to work with non-humanities people in the strict sense of the word. It's been really illuminating and eye-opening. And to be able to find a place with these editors as let's say a discipline not so usually associated with the study of the carceral. But I guess the comments on the aesthetic in that sense, I find it really fascinating always to hear from anthropologists, also other social scientists, right, on how sort of these engagements with the prison take place. And one of my PhDs who's here, I believe, Peyman Amiri, is also writing on the role really of writing in resistance, in experiences of the prison, right? So it seems to me also from your comments, there's several roles, I guess, that the aesthetic plays. And I was triggered here by the reference to Brecht. Sorry for taking so much time, right? But the idea in which art offers, I guess, healing through, right? So there is a certain recognition of trauma that can be worked around or worked with in an aesthetic expression. But then there is also a sense of in which the aesthetic can offer alienation, a productive alienation, thinking about Brecht here, of a certain environment, right? So there's always this multifaceted core, I think, to an aesthetic engagement that goes really well actually with exuberance and also with joy and with laughter, where art, and maybe laughter is also art in a way, right? So that sort of art is a way in which people mimic their surroundings, but also try to have agency over their surroundings where there isn't any, right? And in this sense, I guess the aesthetic is usually seen as an excess or as something that's not central to the traumatic experience, but might actually be survival and very much a necessity. So I was just trying to tie in, I guess, to this debate also Julienne's comments, like maybe the fringe should come to the center. Maybe the exuberance is not so much a fringe as it is really a basic sort of very survivalist response. Jen also mentioned this in relation to wanting to shift to different forms, even within academic writing, of having to deal with all this material, right? So these, just to chime in really, finding it really fascinating how people across disciplines are working with this material. But bottom line, I'm humbled and greatly appreciative and grateful for this space.
Thanks, Hanneke, for sharing that. I'm also deeply, deeply grateful for this space because next week in my carceral geography course, I have to teach about carceral worlds and the expansion of the idea of carcerality beyond the prison. And I think maybe I'll take Dominique's line about the prison being kind of overtly there but not there throughout this whole volume, and so yes, you'll be pleased to know that my students have got a wealth of reading on offer to them next week from this volume, but maybe I have to do a little bit of a better job of persuading them about the importance of activism, whether that's reformist activism or abolitionist activism, and I think that's an ongoing challenge. Do I have any more questions in the room? I know there's lots of things going on in the chat there, helpful tips with each other, sharing of course outlines, and so on. I think I will allow a few seconds for final remarks, final hands, final thoughts. No. Okay. We're happy to keep things to time as always, and to keep things with a nice kind of feeling of leaving people wanting more, perhaps. And perhaps on that subject of wanting more, I would encourage everyone who hasn't engaged with the book yet, not necessarily to go and buy the book, although please feel free to do that if you'd like to. Perhaps more appropriately, get your institutions to order it for your libraries, and maybe that's a more practical way to approach things. But what I mean is, please do, if you would like to, please do engage with each other. Do write to our authors. I know that they would be happy to get in touch about their work and perhaps to talk about their ongoing projects and how they might be using this chapter to move forward in their next steps of whatever kind of carceral thinking that may be. I think I will round us up for today. A few more. Oh, sorry, Julienne, I didn't see that you had a hand there. Did you have a hand?
Yes, I just wanted to say there is a 30% discount on the book at the moment. So for those for whom, I mean, we wanted the book to be cheap, but we have to get a number of copies sold before it can be a paperback. But it is at the moment a 30% discount. And I think that will be throughout the Christmas, quote unquote, Christmas period. And I also wanted to say that some ways to stay in touch, I guess, are also the networks that have been so gracious also in helping set out, which is why we got, I think, 90-something signups to this event. And we're so happy to have like 35 people here. The Carceral Geography Working Group, I guess Jen will paste their contact details, so how you can sign up. These are all free networks. Also the Anthropology of Confinement Network, and of course the Global Prisons Research Network. So if you are new to any of these topics, themes, or want to keep on connecting and finding out where other kinds of events around carcerality are and discussions around carcerality are taking place, please feel free to reach out to any of these networks, and we cross-share a lot. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to say. So, Jen.
Thanks. No, Julienne, you beat me to it, which is obviously a sign of three minds working as one over the last 4 years on this project. So yeah, I think the links are all in the chat now, with thanks to those people who have been involved in organising on behalf of those networks. I will say nothing more. I have to say, once again, I have really enjoyed the opportunity and to have this format, because I hope you'll agree that I think it was really nice to get those tasters from different authors and reflections for our endorsers. So my final thanks from today on behalf of myself, Hanneke and Julienne, is to say thank you to you all for joining us, for your thoughts on the volume, and whether it's from us or from the next persons who might be involved in a similar project. We hope that you will consider to carry on thinking about our carceral worlds in whatever way, shape or form they continue to emerge. So thank you everyone for your attention, and we look forward to the next opportunity to engage in various ways. Take care, stay warm wherever you are.